Hey everyone, welcome to the Adam Makes Beer Recipe Creation Workshop. This is the ingredient overview episode, and in this episode we're going to be running through some big picture concepts when it comes to malt, some adjuncts, hops, yeast, water, ways of using fruit, herbs, spices, and things like that. This episode is meant to build some high-level concepts surrounding these things, and it's going to serve to give us better insight into the rest of the course. As always, if you're getting value out of this, please make sure to like, share, sub, share it with other brewing friends, homebrew clubs, other pro brewers that you know. Throw it on Reddit, throw it anywhere. Get the word out. I'd really appreciate it. Let's start diving into our overview on malt today. First of all, a couple of useful resources that you should have available to you. You should jump online to various maltsters. I know Wireman is very good at this. They have sensory spider graphs available. Those can go a long way to helping you understand the flavors and aromas that you can expect in the finished beer from each individual product. And they'll also have deep dive spec sheets for each of the different malts. That'll help you to better understand how to utilize them in the beer. I think it's great to reach out to suppliers, various maltsters, and get their sample packs. A lot of times they will send you a whole box that'll usually have some swag in it and a whole bunch of different types of malt. I'm a very big believer in doing sensory on all of those. As you go through and are doing sensory tasting and smelling of those different malts, after a while, try not to do a ton of them at once. That can make it a little bit difficult and you can kind of dig into palate fatigue. But look into ways of cleansing your palate, whether it be drinking water, in between doing aromatic tests, doing the old arm smell to clear that olfactory region, right? So that's another really good thing too that will help you on the malt front. And also consider checking out the malt book from the Brewers Association. That book is a monster deep dive on all topics related to malt. So that's a good one to check out as well. When I think about malt, what I like to think about are kind of three different flavor spectrums. The first one is the flavor spectrum surrounding bread, flavor spectrum surrounding sugar, and then finally surrounding roast. Base malts, as it suggests, is going to end up being the base or the supermajority of the malt that is being used in your grist. Base malt is also the big driver of diastatic power, which is a malt's ability to convert its starches to sugar. The paler malt you have, typically the higher in diastatic power it is. The more kilned it is, the darker it is, generally the lower. We'll be diving into diastatic power a little bit more in a following episode, but just register that in your mind right now. With base malt, we kind of get into that range of that bread type spectrum that I was mentioning before. When you think about bread, you can have anything from doughy to white bread, cracker, biscuit, anything in that range. You can even start getting lightly toasty. You can get nutty out of that flavor range. Generally, the more color that a base malt has, the more flavor, and you'll start sliding down that scale. So imagine you're taking your piece of white bread, your Wonder Bread, putting it in the toaster, pushing it down, toasting it just in a very pale way, right? And then toast it a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. You can kind of have that sliding scale of white bread into toasty, deep toasty, right? Into that nutty range, right? There is a caveat also. There are some outliers with base malt. One of the ones that we can touch on is the Beechwood smoked malt that you can get from Wireman and probably from some other suppliers as well. That's a base malt that has been dried using beechwood smoke. So it's a little bit of an outlier because you can get a significant smoke character out of that, but it's still a base malt. You can still use that as the heart and soul of the beer that you're building. There are other darker malts that are smoked as well, and we can get into those when we talk about specialty malt, the specialty malt deep dive that we'll do. In general, with base malts, we're kind of talking about that flavor and aroma spectrum of breads, kind of getting a little bit toastier, a little bit nuttier. You can even get some raw character out of it as well. Sometimes I think wheat can have kind of a doughy type concept. And when we say wheat, I'm talking about malted wheat for this discussion. Just briefly, and maybe I should have mentioned it before, but when we talk about like the concept of like a malted, base malt, it is grain that's gone through the malting process, which gives it the capacity to convert the starch that it has into sugar in the right conditions in the mash. Next, we can kind of jump into that sugar spectrum with malt, and we can start looking at the crystal or caramalts. Think about making a simple syrup solution, something that you might use for sweetening cocktails. And then if you take that simple syrup solution and continue to boil it, it's going to go into from clear to blonde, start moving more and more toward caramel. And then even further beyond that, you can get into dark fruit and kind of like a roasty dark fruit, right? You have an interesting flavor range there. Think about those crystal malts that we have access to. There's crystal malts that go all the way down to, like 1, 2, 3 Lovibond. And so they're going to be kind of more in that simple syrup type concept range. And you can start moving to like a crystal 40. I think a lot of people, I came up early on, the big crystal malt was crystal 40. Crystal 40 was in everything. Crystal 40, crystal 60 can kind of get you into that. Maybe crystal 40 more particularly can get you into kind of that little caramel square thing that you might get in an Easter basket here in the States. The big idea is that we're dealing with this spectrum of sugar flavors. And this is something that you can be driving through this wide range of crystal type malts. You can find crystal malts 150 Lovibond and north. And so just think of them on that spectrum. And these are great malts to taste because they taste good in my mind. Not that base malt doesn't, but the key is with crystal malts, it's almost like there's been a little mini mash inside that kernel, right? All of that starch has been converted to sugar and then kilned or cooked to different color depths, color and flavor depths. A big key with crystal malts is that they do not have any diastatic power. So they're not going to help your mash convert the available starch to sugar, and that they are a malt that can really just be steeped. So not that you would see this typically, but you could cap a mash or add it at the sparge if you wanted. We will talk more about that on the roast malt side. But you're really just rinsing the sugar out of those things. You don't need to make the sugar when it comes to crystal malts, caramalts. It's already in there. It's more an issue of steeping and rinsing those things through. And then the final spectrum that we're going to talk today as far as malt flavor goes is kind of this roast spectrum. I think a great way to think about that might be kind of the more artisanal coffee type concept, because I think we've all had like really aggressively roasted coffees, kind of bitter coffees, kind of the far end of that roast spectrum. But if you jump into some of those artisanal coffees, my son's getting really into this right now. And so it's interesting. He has a little disposable income, and so he can afford to buy some expensive coffee. And so a lot of these coffees that he's buying are much more on the lighter end of the roast scale, light to medium, right? And it allows those things to express different aromatics, different more subtle aromatics that might get roasted out the darker you go. But that's kind of that flavor range, right? We can put a whole range of chocolate under this umbrella. Anything like we mentioned on the roast side, so like a light roast coffee, medium roast, dark roast, and even goes beyond that. When we're using certain roasted malts in different stouts, you can definitely generate a smoky character out of it, sometimes even ashy, depending on what people want to be doing with that. Some of those things might sound good to you, they might sound bad, but that's personal preference, right? These are malts that have no diastatic power. And again, like crystal malts, you're going to be rinsing those roast characters, those roast flavors and aromas out of them, okay? One thing to keep in mind with roast malt is when you are using roast malt and both crystal malt, they can significantly impact your mash pH. They're going to be driving it down. So where you might see that when you're making pale beers, you have to do certain water adjustments, acid adjustments, things like that in order to get your pH, to lower your pH to where you want it to be. You might not have to do the same level of water adjustment when you're using roast malt and crystal malt, because they can add a significant amount of acidity to that mash to get you into the mashing range that you want to be. Let's dip into pre-gelatinized grain adjuncts real quick. You can be talking about anything from things that build body to things that reduce body. There's a couple that I really like for building body. One is flaked oats. And again, remember we said pre-gelatinized. So these are ready to be used in the mash. They do not have to go through a cereal cooker or anything like that. First off is oats. Oats are big these days and have been for the past several years, where hazy IPA has really become a big thing. Part of the reason that they're big for that is they provide beta glucans, which are viscous. It's a viscous mouthfeel contributor. Okay, so you can make a soft, rounded mouthfeel. That can be part of your element of driving mouthfeel with hazy IPA. But originally, we used to talk about it with oatmeal stout, right? To help make a beer round and silky. Another flaked product that I like to use is flaked rye. You can use malted rye as well. Malted rye for me, though, is a little bit difficult to work with sometimes. Sometimes you have to adjust your mill gap in order to break that down appropriately because it may be thinner than your base malt. And sometimes adjusting a mill gap can be a pain. I've worked on a few different ones. Some are easy, some are a pain. But I personally find that malted rye is earthier. Sometimes people say spicy when they talk about it. I'm not crazy about that descriptor, but that could just be my palate. For me, it's malted rye is much more earthy. Now, when I use flaked rye, and I've used flaked rye to considerable proportions, and if you remember way back when session IPA was much more of a thing than it is these days, I've made beers with 23% flaked rye, and I do not get that earthiness out of it. But to me personally, if I'm going to choose between flaked oats and flaked rye, when I talk about viscosity and adding body slickness to a beer, flaked rye is where it's at for me personally. And sometimes I think it's a little underrepresented when it comes to the discussion on adding body to a beer. Those are two pre-gelatinized adjuncts that you can be adding to your mash that can help build body. On the flip side, you can also add pre-gelatinized rice, and it comes in many different forms. Rice can be great for being very neutral in flavor, not adding body to the beer. So now we're talking about a couple of things that are body reducers in a beer. You can utilize this in any time you want to have a beer that you want to pull the body down in. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but one of them is using flaked rice. It's a really common adjunct in light lager. You'll see people using them in big hoppy IPAs as well to help get the malt out of the way and just help the hop shine. I think it's useful, good tool. I've used it a lot. I would recommend that you do an iodine test when you utilize your rice to make sure you're getting the extraction out of it that you think you are early in your process. In the same measure, you can use corn as well. Corn is another low color, pretty neutral adjunct that you can lighten up the body of the beer. Now, in my mind, compared to rice, corn can be a little bit more flavor forward. It's not necessarily a DMS type thing that you can get in a beer, like a cooked corn thing, but there can be a corn sweetness that comes through. And even if it's a perceived sweetness, because sometimes you can have flavors and aromas that suggest sweetness that can almost infer it or imply it in the beer, but the beer is still very dry. Both rice and corn are two things that will ferment out completely, can make a nice lean beer, but I do think flake corn can have that perception of sweetness at certain usage rates. Jumping into our overview on hops. The first thing that I want to discuss is this idea of when people talk about hoppy beers. I think it's really important as brewers and the language that we use around hops. Rather than just generally saying the word hoppy, I think when most people say hoppy, what they mean is they mean bitter. A lot of times we'll hear people say, I don't like hoppy beers. And what they're probably saying is they don't like bitter beer. A lot of people love hop flavor and aroma though, especially those tropical, fruity, juicy things that are so prevalent on the scene right now. So I think it's important when we use our language around this that we need to be separating those hop descriptors up a little bit. We need to be talking about hop bitterness, hop flavor, and hop aroma. And you can kind of even throw in like a hop mouthfeel type character as well, because later when we talk about, more aggressive dry hopping regimens that can be used on the IPA side. We can be talking about some of the mouthfeel, viscosity, slickness, aggressiveness that those things can introduce there. But I do think it's important to separate those things out so we're conveying ourselves clearly and we have a good understanding of what we're trying to do when we're writing recipes. Useful references when it comes to hops. Yakima Chief has an awesome hop survivables chart available on their website. You need to dig in on that. Great information. Couple that with the information in the new IPA. Dig into the hop data sheets. One of the areas that I'm not super strong in, I'm not super strong on all of the different hop oils, the thiols, the sulfur precursors, all these different things. That's not my strength, but we can kind of have some high level discussions of how we can be utilizing certain hop varietals in order to maximize their character in your beers or make the beer that you want to be making with those hops, right? The more you dig into the hop data sheets that are available from various hop growers, suppliers, I'm seeing some really great data sheets coming out right now that will have 2 spider graphs on them. One will be sensory on the hop itself, and one will be sensory on how the hop expresses in the beer, because there is a difference. There's a lot of times you cut that bag of hops open, you smell it, you're like, man, I wish this is what the final beer smelled like. We're going to talk about some ways that we can try to achieve that. But I love that suppliers are giving us more tools for understanding how to use those ingredients in ways that will give us the beer that we're looking for. First, let's discuss hops as a player in bitterness. When I'm making beer, if I'm going to have a bittering edition, or the edition where I expect to be getting the majority of my backbone of bitterness for the beer, which for me, I will typically boil those hops for 60 minutes. I prefer to use high alpha, low cohumulone hops. Low cohumulone hops help to give a smoother, less coarse bitterness to the beer, which is just something I prefer. And the high alpha acid, all that high alpha acid means is that it has a greater capacity of generating bitterness in your finished beer, right? So a high alpha hop will generate more bitterness used in the same amount at the same time in the boil. It'll generate more bitterness than a hop with lower alpha acids. I like to take that high alpha, low cohumulone approach in the bittering portion of the boil because I do like that cleaner bitterness. I also, if I'm going to be using a bunch of hops toward the end too, I don't want to be throwing tons of green matter into the kettle, both for polyphenol reasons and for loss reasons. I don't want to be soaking up all this work with this large volume of hops. I do think there's times when you can use lower alpha acid hops in the boil, and I don't have an issue with it, but just generally as a rule of thumb, I prefer to use higher alpha, clean bittering hops. Things like Warrior, Magnum, Horizon, I believe is a older school British one. Things like that. That's what I like to use in that way. I personally do not find that I get a tremendous amount of flavor or aroma out of anything like that. I've brewed some pretty gently flavored and aromaed beers that have used even American style hops, high alpha American style hops at bittering, and it doesn't come through necessarily. So in my mind, when I'm boiling a hop for 60 minutes, I'm not expecting to carry a lot of flavor and aroma. If you are making gently flavored lager, gently flavored beers, and you are concerned about carrying flavor over, use something more neutral, all right? I think it's a better use anyways. You don't want to be using, I don't know, baller hops for a bittering addition if you don't have to. It's just a waste. Let's start looking at some of the kind of umbrellas for different hop varietals. We'll start off with some of the noble hops, Hallertau, Saaz, Spalt, however people pronounce things, Tettnang, and there's a range of them. In my mind, these hops are definitely more subtle. I think they have some beautiful characteristics, some very traditional German, Czech, British type aroma and flavor components that they bring. Sometimes people say they can be earthy or spicy. Again, I see spicy, not as in like hot pepper or anything like that. Sometimes spicy is not always my favorite descriptor for certain things, but definitely on that floral, earthy type end of it. That's where I find those things. The intensity of the flavor on these hops are not banging like hops that you might be getting that are in really good shape from the Pacific Northwest, okay, of the United States. They're not as aggressive, but they're your classic hops that you're going to be seeing in a lot of historical beer styles. They're beautiful, they're great. They tend to be lower alpha acid. And again, they make up the backbone of a lot of, really beautiful classic beer styles and can be used folded into other styles as well. And then we're going to talk about this next umbrella of kind of like IPA hops. All right, you might not like that umbrella or not, but that's how I'm gonna clump these up. Typically, these are hops that are grown in the United States and the Pacific Northwest. They're New Zealand hops, they're Australian hops. These hops tend to be much higher in alpha acid and have a much different character, and they're much more aggressive in my mind. I think for the Pacific Northwest character, you can be looking at pine, cannabis, caddy, citrus, tropical, dank. I think we have an understanding for what all those things are. I will say, like when people talk about caddy, we are talking about actually like cat pee. It can kind of be this musky, kind of earthy body kind of thing. It's a polarizing character. You can also throw things that have an alliaceous nature, something that has kind of an onion garlic. Again, that can be hotly debated, just like caddy, right? But hops that can have a little bit of cat to them, we're not talking about ammonia, okay? That's too much, that's too far. But sometimes for some people that cattiness can kind of be like a nice component. Sometimes you can get cattiness out of Simcoe. I remember some old brewer buddies of mine or would always laugh and say, don't try to feed me that cat piss. Is there Simcoe in here? But that can be crop year dependent, pick time, different things like that. But those are the flavors and aromas that we're looking at typically with Pacific Northwest hops. And then on the New Zealand, Australian side, I think we tend to be tropical and even into like to the melon range. It's a little softer, rounder. These hops can be beautiful as well. But again, a lot of these hops are higher alpha acid, a lot more hop oils, a lot more resiny, much more sticky. And they're going to be things that you see people using in the mid kettle, late kettle, dry hopping, everything like that. Sometimes people separate this concept of bittering hops, aroma hops, and bittering hops, flavor hops, and aroma hops. I think that notion is kind of going away. Really anytime you have hops going in 30 minutes and under, you can probably pretty reliably, based on how aromatic potentially aromatic and flavorful those hops are, that you're going to get flavors and aromas into the finished beer. However, the closer you get them to knockout or a cool pool or anything like that, the more likely you're going to be maintaining those hop flavors and aromas into the finished beer, depending on what kind of hops they're using. Again, you'll want to be referencing that hop survivables chart from Yakima Chief. Great tool. Do note that as you're inputting these various hops into your calculator, you're going to see that if you add X amount of this hop at 60 minutes or the same amount at 30 minutes, you're going to be generating less bitterness the less amount of time that hop is boiled. And that's going to continue as you boil that hop for shorter and shorter periods of time. When we're referencing IPA, and we'll dig into this more later, depending on what you're doing, a lot of times you'll see kind of a classic 90-minute approach. If you remember the Dogfish at 90 minute IPA, right? Where it's constantly hopped all the way through. That's one approach. You can have an aggressive hop charge up front at 60 minutes, something at 20, 10, 5. Maybe that's kind of another like older school IPA concept. Sometimes people are just getting in some baseline bitterness at 60, whether that be with a clean bittering hop or even hop extract. And then they're blasting the whirlpool with a ton of hops, and then all the other hops are coming downstream. There's a lot of approaches there. I did mention that cool pool concept with the dawn and evolution of hazy IPA. We see increasingly people are using this concept of dropping the temperature of their whirlpool by pumping the wort that has gone through its full boil, pumping that through their heat exchanger, cooling it, and returning it back to their kettle, dropping it from anywhere from 160 degrees. Some people go lower, up to, maybe dropping it to 190, 195. There's various ways that you can do that, and various temperature ranges you can hit. One of the reasons people want to be able to do that is they feel as if they can get certain hop characters out of different temperatures. Also, when you drop the temperature, that contact, that hop and hot wort contact, the cooler that temperature is, the slower that isomerization or bitterness generation happens, right? So it's a way that you can put more hops in and not generate as much bitterness. The reason you might want to do that is because you're trying to maximize the infusion of hop oils into that beer for flavor and aroma's sake, but you want to be minimizing the generation of bitterness so you can still have this nice, soft, round, juicy beer. Let's take a high-level look at yeast. Some useful resources for this is your yeast lab spec sheets. Yeast labs are doing a better and better job at giving us more and more information as to what exactly their yeasts do, what they do well, and the parameters around which they do those things. This is an instance where I think networking on one level, and also just reaching out to various labs and getting in contact with their department, with their lab, and talking to people on the lab side, and talking to them about things like some of the key elements of manipulating yeast strains to get them to do the things you want them to do. Some of those things are fermentation temperature, adjusting fermentation temperature up or down, pitch count, viability, O2 levels when you're knocking out. I think I already mentioned pitch temp. There's other factors. We have more data than ever available to us through those yeast providers. Take a deep dive and dig in on that stuff, because I think sometimes the magic, the intangibles around a certain beer have a lot to do with all of these inputs and ways that you can tweak and handle yeast, okay? So that's worth a deep dive, and we'll be digging into that more later. When I'm looking at building a menu for a brew pub that I'm working at, I try to think about yeast strains in a couple of different ways. In general, I think about a lager yeast, a clean ale yeast, and a hazy strain. I know there's wit beer stuff, there's Hefeweizen strains, there's Belgian strains, there's all sorts of different strains. But we're just talking nuts and bolts recipe creation. Having a lager strain, a clean ale strain, and a hazy strain, you can do a lot of things with. Obviously, with the lager strain, you can do a wide range of lagers. Clean ale strain, you can be doing all of your hybrid type beers. You can be doing West Coast IPA, blonde ales, yeast growing, yeast propping batches, right, for a light beer that can help you going on some of your other clean ale strain need beers. And then finally, a hazy strain. Some people are still resisting making it. That's fine if you are, but I know a lot of people are making money selling these beers. And so a nice hazy strain can work well in there as well. So I kind of think about it under three umbrellas. For me personally, I have used a ton of yeast from Omega, and I've used a ton of yeast from Imperial, but there is a ton of great yeast out there. I've used Harvest and Global from Imperial for a lot of things. I'm a huge fan of Harvest. I think it's really easy to work with. I think you can have it be very clean. It can also be a little bit more expressive. It's really easy to harvest, really easy to work with in the brewery. I love it. But some people like a cleaner strain as well, like Global. You can also be using those strains for cold IPA or any of these IPA iterations that they're using with lager strains if you're not too opposed to that. You can also look up a yeast comparison chart to separate those things out and check for cross-check at some labs that you might be used to using. When it comes to hazy IPA, I've used Juice, Conan, I've used Heliogazer, some of the thiol stuff. Those are good options. I would lean more Juice, Conan, personally, just for me with than some of the thiolized strains. I think you can lose some of the thiol character with the more aggressive green matter going into some of those beers, but they're all fun to play with. And then with adjunct ales, I think that just a clean ale yeast and even dry yeast works well in here. I've used anything from, liquid strain Chico to dry 04, dry 05, especially when I know if I'm going to be putting an adjunct in on the fermenter side and that yeast is essentially going to be a dump. Sometimes dry yeast can be a good alternative for that. Let's dip our toes into water real quick. I am not the world's expert on water, but I am kind of the bare bones functional guy when it comes to it. Some useful resources when we're digging into water is getting familiar with the Brewing Water spreadsheet that you can download. I think it's tremendous. It's what I used. And the other thing that you need is you need a lab tested water report. And it maybe needs to be done seasonally depending on how often your water supply shifts. We're going to go just real light with this info here, and we're going to go with the keep it simple, stupid concept. That's what I deal with. In general, I get my water report, I input it into Brewing Water, and then it'll give me a readout of what is going to be left in my final beer. I shoot for 50 to 100 parts per million calcium in my beers in general, up and down for different styles. In general, I shoot for a mash pH of 5.35. Again, you can adjust that up or down. And I'm usually making that pH adjustment with either food grade phosphoric or food grade lactic acid. I will go ahead and play with my chloride levels and my sulfate levels, and I'll do that by adjusting up and down the amount of calcium chloride and calcium sulfate that I'm using. We can talk about parameters on that a little bit later when we're kind of discussing maybe some different styles or whatnot, or just some big umbrella ideas when it comes to that. I think that you can use sulfate to generate a beer that is crisper, and it doesn't make bitterness more bitter, but I think like binoculars, if you put binoculars up and you rotate the focus thing, I think it doesn't make, when you use the binoculars, it doesn't make the image bigger, it clarifies it. And I think that's what sulfate does with bitterness. It doesn't make bitterness bigger, it just makes it clearer, more crisp in the beer. Okay, so you can kind of push sulfate up when you want to do that, or you can be manipulating your body with calcium chloride or with chloride. I think chloride can make something softer, leaner. Oh, no. It can make something softer, rounder. Using sulfate can make something crisp. Okay? You can use those in balance. You can feature one over the other. Those are all tools at your disposal. Let's dip real quickly into fruit. When we get into this discussion of fruit, I think it's really important that we really do drill down on our SOPs and make sure that we're handling everything in a clean, aseptic way as much as we can, that we try to prevent cans and packages from exploding. I think those are all important things. But just big picture when it comes, whether you're going to be using a fruit puree, a natural TTB approved extract, or concentrates, all those things can and should be benchtop ahead of time. So what I would recommend is when you have a finished beer, take a liter of it and by milliliters, dose it and taste that along a scale, right? I think that's very, very key. I get questions about adding adjunct all the time on the fruit side, on the spice side, different things like that. I think that's a very good way of going about it. I think puree can be difficult because it can add pectin to your beer or kind of a permanent haze. You can have loss when you use it because you're trying not to draw that haze off potentially. If you're fermenting it out, you're going to be losing some of that oomph from it. It's a reason why concentrate on the cold side might be a good option. Sometimes you're going to be looking at needing to stabilize those beers. But the three big things that I would suggest looking at are puree, extracts, and concentrates. I know people have different feelings about extracts and concentrates. I don't blame you if you do, but I think you can drive using good manufacturers. I think you can layer in some very nice flavors and aromas with those things. But the key is getting familiar with this bench topping. Pull a specific volume and dose multiple samples and start smelling and doing sensory tasting on what you're getting out of them. I think it's probably the most effective way to do that. So you need to be reaching out to multiple suppliers and getting, if you want blueberry, get 3 or 4 different blueberry examples or more, right? And start dosing things. So it's kind of the high level view on using fruit, extracts, concentrates. And then similarly with herbs and spices. Now, I think you can layer these up a little bit differently. I think that you can do things on the cold side in fermentation and on hot side. If you're doing something powdered, I've seen plenty of places that will use powdered stuff at Whirlpool or with 10 minutes left in the boil, and it goes in straight into the kettle, and they don't have issues downstream with their heat exchanger. If you are dealing with larger particulate, cocoa nibs, whole cinnamon, different things like that, you're definitely going to want to bag those things up in a boil-safe, food-safe bag that can be hung or floated or whatnot in there, tied off to the side of the kettle or whatever, so that doesn't end up getting sucked into your heat exchanger. That's probably the way you want to be doing that. I do like the idea of layering in flavor from the hot side. You are going to lose some of that flavor and aroma as it goes through the fermentation, but you can layer on top of it on the backside with extracts, concentrates, different things like that, or just, again, the raw product again. Sometimes people make tinctures, teas, things like that out of various spices or herbs that can go in on the cold side as well. It's another way to work with it. That's our wrap on our ingredient overview. It's a huge help for me for you to be dropping comments and questions down below, because I'm going to be coming back to this later and adding on, answering those questions, things that I missed. Some of the things that you might be asking maybe things that are going to be included in deeper dives later in the series, but it might just plain be stuff that I missed. And so you can help me edit and improve this thing, and I'll make another video as an addendum to this ingredient overview. As always, appreciate you watching, appreciate your support, and I'll talk to you later.